You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. Welcome to RevOps FM, everyone. Today's guest is a marketer, an entrepreneur, and a writer, Wes Kao. In 2014, she launched Alt MBA with Seth Godin, which has served thousands of students, and then she went on to co-found Maven, which is a platform for live, cohort-based courses. But I became familiar with Wes through her weekly newsletter at Wes Kao. That's weskao.com, which reaches more than 250,000 readers. And if you're not already one of them, you should definitely go check it out. It is one of my favorites. And Wes touches on marketing, she touches on ops, she touches on entrepreneurship, but really why I like her writing is that she's often dealing with topics that are kind of a level deeper than any one functional area. She writes about how to think, how to communicate, how people relate to each other in a business context, how to make decisions. Stuff that's really part of the core operating system of business life. And she brings this clarity of insight and a keenness of observation to these topics. I think no one else writes more posts that when I see them, I think, I wish I could have written that. So Wes, I am thrilled to have you on the show today, and I really look forward to chatting with you.
Thanks, Justin. And those were very kind words, so thank you.
So I wrote that intro, and then I saw on your website you wrote that you are fascinated by topics that are deceivingly basic, which is essentially a much more pithy way of saying what I just said. And I thought it was a perfect description of your subject matter. I'm just curious, we can start with why do those subjects appeal to you? What draws you to write about that?
I think that there are a lot of pieces of advice that we see on a daily basis around management, leadership, being good at your job that are too generic and too captain obvious. You know, you read it and you're like, yes, I agree with that. Of course I agree with that. Like, who would disagree? And yet, trying to put it into practice, there's definitely a gap. And so where is that gap? Clearly, it's something between this abstract theory and the realities of daily life and real relationships and real situations at work. So I love topics that are deceivingly basic because you might think, oh, well, I already understand that, or there's nothing left to unpack there. But very often there is. And I think that the upside is in understanding on a deeper level, whether it's the specifics or the concrete or the nuances of a situation. So I like unpacking that every week in my newsletter because I personally find it fascinating, and I love nerding out with other people who also find it fascinating.
I'm sure other people touch on these subjects, but I don't see a lot of them out there. And maybe that's why your work is resonating with a lot of people, because it's things that, like for me, when I read it, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. I don't know, I'll use a concrete example. You were talking about the power dynamics of a situation where you're sending your like Calendly link to somebody. Like, it's just things that people process in this almost unconscious way. And you're kind of teasing that up and bringing it to the surface and holding it to the light. So I just find that really valuable. Is that just sort of a natural, you make an observation and you find it interesting, or are you deliberately searching these situations out?
Basically, whenever I catch myself thinking something, I pause and ask why. And try to think, is there something beneath that? And is my reaction justified? So a lot of my posts come from me asking myself, is my reaction justified? And there's this great subreddit that's very popular called Am I the Asshole? AITA. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's amazing. So basically, people from the internet submit situations that they're dealing with and ask for help figuring out, there's 4 options. 1 is you are the asshole. 2 is the other person is the asshole. 3 is neither of you are assholes. 4 is both of you are assholes. And then 5 is there's not enough information.
I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode, Knack. You know, I love marketing automation software, but let's be honest, the email and landing page builders are usually terrible. You can't make it nice without a developer, and marketers are going to find a way to break things or go off brand. You do not have time for that. So Knack is totally different. You set the guidelines and then give your users a building experience that's slick, modern, and beautiful. When they're done, everything goes to your map at the push of a button. And don't worry, it supports global teams, approval workflows. It's got your integrations. So head on over to revops.fm/knack. That's KNAK, and get a special offer just for my listeners.
And so I think about AITA all the time in my own life, you know? So if I get a Calendly request from someone who sounds a little bit too cavalier, a little bit entitled or demanding, a biz dev person in my LinkedIn DMs, sliding into the DMs saying like, pick a time here. That feels off to me. So when I get the feeling of like, oh, like that feels weird, I like to think like, wait, am I being unreasonable? Or is the other person being unreasonable? Or maybe are we both potentially being unreasonable? And I try to think about that in a bit more granularity. And usually I like thinking about both sides. So I like thinking about both the person sending that message and the person receiving it. Because I am often that person sending outreach, right? Like all of us are, whether it's, an intro email or DMing someone that you think is cool, you've been following their work. Like we are often on both sides of a situation, depending on the circumstances. So I like putting myself in the shoes of both parties and thinking, why might someone have done that? Why might it have felt like the appropriate thing to do for that person? Why might it have been reasonable in their mind? And then on the other side, why is that the person who received it who felt like, hey, like that felt a little bit off? Why is that person also justified? And then what can both parties do to better translate their intent into reality? Because I think a lot of times, like when we're the ones pitching or when we're the ones making a request to other people, we're not thinking, hey, I want to be entitled, or hey, I want to come off as someone who doesn't appreciate other people's time. Like no one is thinking that, right? But yet you still come across that way sometimes because your execution didn't take into account certain nuances, that the word choice that you used or the posture or assumptions you made when you made this outreach actually made you seem kind of like a jerk. And I always think we can only control our own behavior. And so you can complain that, well, I didn't mean it that way. That wasn't my intent. You can say that and go about living your life. Great, you do you. Or you can realize that, if the other person is interpreting what I'm saying a certain way and they're interpreting it not the way I want them to, then I have the power to adjust the way that I communicate. I have the power to adjust the way that I pitch or make a request or whatever. And so I'm trying to always decrease the space between your intent and the impact and reality of what the other person is actually hearing from you.
One of those things that you've talked about a lot is rigorous thinking, which again is something that we have to think to do everything at work, like every decision, every task that we work on, but it's sort of like we're focused on like the tactics or the strategies or the end results, not even like what's actually happening on an individual level to produce that. Maybe just walk us through a little bit like your point of view on rigorous thinking, why it's important.
Rigorous thinking is having a systematic approach to making decisions. We hear a lot about the importance of thinking strategically, but I find that the word strategy gets thrown around so much. And, this person is strategic, this person is not. It gets thrown around so much that I think it's lost its meaning a bit. So I like saying rigorous thinking, because to me, rigorous thinking is sharing your logic and thought process and rationale behind why you are doing something and inviting critique. So there's two parts of rigorous thinking. First is asking yourself hard questions about why are you doing this and what's the best way to do it. If we're trying to get from point A to point B, what are the different steps needed? What are the assumptions that we're making? What does success look like? And putting a bit of thought up front into your approach before diving straight in. I think sometimes people push back and say, well, like, I don't have time for rigorous thinking. Isn't it all about shipping fast and diving right in and iterating, learning by doing? To which I say it's both and. So you should put a little bit of thought up front into what you're about to do and then jump into doing it. And you're going to learn and iterate, of course, but you don't want to burn your energy making avoidable mistakes. So I do think that there are better and worse mistakes. There's a spectrum. There's some things where if you literally thought about it for 10 seconds, you would have realized that this was an obvious risk. So you can either waste your energy on those, or you can spend that energy iterating from a higher baseline. So that's kind of part one, is putting some thought up front into what you're about to do. Part two is the debate culture aspect. So no matter how much thinking you put up front, there's going to be potential holes in the way you're looking at something because you're looking at it from your own singular perspective. And one of the powerful things about rigorous thinking is encouraging a culture of debate where any idea goes. Anyone at any level can propose an idea and make a suggestion, make a recommendation, but you should be prepared to explain your thinking behind that, to advocate for your idea and to make the business case for it, and to welcome critique. That once you share your idea, that other people are allowed to poke holes and ask you about how does this part work, or I'm not quite sure I agree with this assumption, or I feel like you're making a logical leap getting from here to here. And that is very much a part of rigorous thinking. And so, one way I suggest managers and leaders to start encouraging a culture of rigorous thinking is to ask their team members, what do you think? Give people a chance to think rigorously, to put all these questions into play for themselves, to feel on the hook and to feel skin in the game. If you're always the one doing all the rigorous thinking and then structuring, scoping, and shaping a project before giving it to someone for them to execute, they're never going to have the opportunity to ask these hard questions for themselves. So you can't be surprised when, they're not quote unquote thinking strategically. So it's about really putting the thought up front, allowing and encouraging debate, and then giving your team a chance to really practice that.
There's a lot of companies that have this idea of the best idea wins, or we have a culture of, they might not use the term rigorous thinking, but they aspire to that, or they have it as one of their values. In practice, it doesn't always work that way. Ideas get dismissed out of hand, like one person's logic is superior to another person's logic. There's still a lot of this room for subjectivity. How do you address this? Is it just a matter of organizational commitment? Is it a matter of calling it out, especially when it comes from the leadership level, as it often does?
It definitely needs to be something that the leadership team cares about and believes in. I think as an individual in an organization, you have a limited amount of leverage to be able to change things 180 degrees. So it needs to be something that your manager cares about, that your leadership team cares about. And so, usually when I write for, again, both sides. I write for both the direct reader who's going to be implementing rigorous thinking and also for the manager or leader who sometimes needs to be sold too. So with rigorous thinking, for example, I think this is very beneficial for managers and leaders who want their team members to come to them with better ideas. I think a lot of managers end up feeling like the bad guy who always has to say no. Their team is always coming to them saying, can we try this? Or, oh, I think we should do this. And if you're always having to say no, that's not a positive experience for anyone. And you're also having to sift through a lot of bad ideas. And you're also carrying the full weight of doing all the strategic thinking. So I think, really thinking about how is this beneficial for managers who might want to do this and also for team members who want to do this. And I think that that's important to think about, again, both sides, because 90% of managers are also direct reports themselves. So I think we don't really acknowledge or talk about this out loud, or at least I haven't really seen people be explicit about this. It's usually, here's advice for managers and leaders. Here's advice for direct reports. But unless you're the CEO, the CEO reports to the board, but, let's just say 99% of people are not the CEO in an organization. So if you're the CMO, if you're a co-founder, if you're an SVP, you might have a big team and they see you as the boss, but you also have a boss. So really understanding both sides of that, I think, makes us better leaders and managers, where we're able to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. I think as a direct report, you also realize that all the stuff that you worry about with your manager's also worried about with their manager. So there's a little bit of, I don't know if it's Schadenfreude, but a little bit of we're in the same boat here that I think is very encouraging.
Do you find that rigorous thinking is this capability is sort of just a core human trait that anybody can develop, or is it something akin to creativity? Some people are I'm a creative, or I'm a numbers person. Everyone has it to a degree, but some people spike higher in that part of the chart than others.
It's probably both. I think that there are some people who naturally might see more risks and be able to de-risk, for example. So I would say that I'm naturally a hyper-vigilant person, which has pros and cons. So I consider it a strength, though, because my mind just naturally has a filter where I'm constantly thinking what could potentially go wrong, and then how can I stack the deck in my favor towards a favorable outcome. So some people might not think that way. And many times I wish I didn't think that way because it can be kind of hard to turn off sometimes. So everyone has their own strengths. And characteristics that are often, strengths and weaknesses are two sides of the same coin. But I think with rigorous thinking that it is very much a learnable skill. So, I have 20 some questions in my post that you can ask yourself. And many times when you see any one of those questions, you immediately have a reaction. You immediately have an idea. I had a coaching call an hour ago with a client and, we were talking about de-risking something and literally asking the question of, what are potential risks here? I said, I bet you already have some that immediately come to mind. And he said, yes, I already know what they are. Like, we don't need to talk about them. We can move on to the next. And it was great because it just shows that sometimes even asking yourself a certain question or realizing you should think about something is 80% of the battle because your subconscious has already been connecting the dots. So it's more about remembering to pause and think rigorously and then let yourself kind of fill in the blanks from there.
Have you seen a company struggle to get here? Like, what are some of the factors that might lead to a failure to implement this sort of thing on a broad cultural level?
One area where I see leaders sometimes fumble is, they say to their teams, I want you to think rigorously. I want you to put more thought into how this would actually work. And I also want you to speak up to ask clarifying questions. So I want us to be really direct. And then their team member comes to them with a question or with an idea or wanting to have thought partnership and a sparring session. And then the manager either jumps right in to solve the problem for that person or gives that person a wrist slap and makes it a negative experience that the person shared their point of view. I think as humans, as creatures, we are all very sensitive to negative experiences. It becomes a black spot in our memory that, hey, Justin told me that I should come to him and share a point of view and advocate for my idea. I did that. And then he said it was stupid and said to go back to work. If that happens, the chances that that person is going to want to do it again is very low. The other thing to keep in mind is, as a leader, your words carry more weight in the minds of your team. That is just fact. That is just truth. There's a power dynamic there. So even when you say something casually or, flippantly, people might think that you were really serious about it, right? So there's a great Silicon Valley episode where I think the CEO of the Google of the show, I forget what it's called, but it's the fake Google, says something very casual, didn't mean it. I think he said something like, we need more honey for the bear, something like that. And then his team goes off and spends 2 weeks trying to dissect what he means, running around. I think at one point they get a real brown bear, right? And he's like, wait, no, I just meant that in the kitchenette, we ran out of the honey that comes out of the shaped like a bear. And so that's real, right? It's funny because it's true. And so I think as a leader, you just have to be cognizant of that. And my takeaway from it is that I want to really celebrate and reward the behavior that I want to see. If I say, I want you to ask clarifying questions, I want you to raise your hand if you don't understand something, I don't want you to suffer in silence. If my team member comes to me and has a question because they did what I asked, I'm going to celebrate that. I'm going to say, awesome, I love that you brought this up, right? Even if I think the question is maybe not a great question, whatever, the broader point that I want to emphasize is I liked that you brought this up to me. I want you to do this again. This is great. I'm not going to be mad at you. So realizing that you have the power to shape your culture by celebrating certain types of behavior and reinforcing that over time, that becomes your culture. That becomes the way that I talk to Justin. That becomes Justin's leadership style, right? Over and over, that becomes what it's like to work around here.
As you're talking there, I was thinking about past experiences that I've had where a lot of people that end up in very senior leadership positions can be a little bit off the wall sometimes, a little bit zany, a little bit mercurial. And people can form judgments and create impressions very quickly. And if you're worried about that, I better not go to so-and-so with this idea, or I better be careful asking such and such a question, it's really limiting. Like you said, you're not going to do that.
And I think, again, really thinking about what is within our control is useful here. So with a manager and leader, I would say you should expect to repeat yourself more often than you think you will have to. Very often I hear, a CEO will say to everyone or their leadership team, I said this 20 times. how are people not getting it? And then the leadership team will say, I think you said that once, maybe max, twice max. And then the rest of the team will say, wait, you said that at all? Like you said that even once? So there's a little bit of telephone where things get lost. And so as a leader, I think setting your own expectations to not get frustrated that you'll have to repeat yourself. And then second, that to be mindful of, am I celebrating what I want to see? I'd keep those two in mind. But then as a direct report, as a team member, I think it's also important to think what's within my control. And if you realize that CEOs can be mercurial creatures and have their idiosyncrasies, well, what's your takeaway from that? And my takeaway is that you should confirm understanding and feel a sense of ownership for making sure you get what you need from that person. So they should do their part to communicate, etc. But you also need to make sure you get what you need. And I think actually senior leaders are best at managing up. Many junior people think, oh, at a certain point, I won't have to manage up anymore. But actually, senior leaders are best at dealing with CEOs who are sometimes scatterbrained, are sometimes a little bit curt, who don't necessarily think of the other point of view, or who say random things, right? Senior leaders know that they need to parse out, what do you actually mean here? That they need to confirm that this is what I'm about to do, or this is the priority here, right? So they're constantly managing up and realizing that it's your responsibility to get what you need to do a great job, not to expect people to lay out everything for you really neatly, really clearly. When both people do their part, I think that's when a really great manager-direct report relationship happens.
So we've kind of come into the subject of communication. I know you've written dozens of posts on this, so it's like a big, big subject. And something that a lot of people, frankly, I think just struggle with. Like they are under-optimized with their communication and they suffer professionally as a result. So if you had to think of like the top things that someone should work on or implement to just improve in this area, what would they be?
The first thing is probably a concept in the military called bottom line upfront. BLUF, B-L-U-F. The person that you are communicating to might be coming out of a meeting. They might be task switching. They might have a surface level understanding only of what it is that you're doing, or they might not be thinking about it as much. So for ourselves, our work is 100% of the pie. For your manager, your work might be 10% of what they think about on a daily basis because they have 6 other direct reports and their own IC work and managing up to their boss's priorities. So when you just shoot something over without thinking about the right amount of context that person needs, you can end up creating a lot of back and forth, which wastes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and is just frustrating and annoying for everyone. And so when you put the bottom line up front, you are super clear with what it is that you are asserting, whether it's a recommendation, a question, an action item, and then putting context below. So the way that I adapt BLUF in, let's say, a Slack message is putting the main point up front and then saying context, colon, and then I might have paragraphs of context. So what you do there is you are giving your reader agency to either read only the bottom line. If they get it, great, they can move on. Or if they have questions about how you got there, they can read the rest of the context. And I think the reason this is important is because there are some pieces of communication where you can't simply, quote unquote, be concise, right? Because usually people are like, oh, well, just make it shorter. And that's not always practical because the thought process and your rationale behind what it is that you're saying might be actually just as important, if not more important, than the final bottom line that you came up with. The bolder the claim or the more controversial the claim, the more you need to back it up. The more you need to support what it is that you're saying and convince the other person. So sometimes you do need that real estate to describe why it is that you got to where you got to. So putting the main point and then context below, I found is a super useful way to separate out what it is that you're saying and be more concise, but also comprehensive at the same time.
Last November, I watched as my LinkedIn feed blew up with posts from people at Mopsapalooza. They were raving about the conference and having the best time. Don't miss out like I did. This November, Mopsapalooza is back in sunny Anaheim, California, and it's going to be the marketing ops event of the year, packed with hands-on learning from real practitioners. This is the only truly community-led, tech-agnostic MOPS conference out there. It's got the best speakers, the best networking, the best social events, maybe even a trip to Disneyland. This isn't your 50,000-person tech company conference. It's an intimate gathering of folks who are in the trenches every day, and registration is capped at 700 attendees. Tickets are going fast, so go to revops.fm/MOPS. That's revops.fm/MOPS to sign up today. There's a similar kind of idea called the pyramid principle. It came out of McKinsey.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of ex-McKinsey folks where I work, so it's like one of the things we try to practice at my company. It's such a transformational principle, like just reorient, like rather than like blah, 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 blah. So like, all right. And then there's this thing I want you to know or decide or do. Just starting with that bottom line. And it really changes how you're perceived. Not only is it clear for the other person, but you just, like, you seem sharper. You seem more professional, more competent. Why don't more people do this?
Because they don't realize that it's actually doing multiple cognitive steps at the same time. When you're trying to be concise in real time, the reason that it's hard is because you're usually describing something for the first time, right? If you're in conversation talking about something, you're talking in a stream of conscious, you're trying to assess the importance of various things that you're saying as you are saying them. And so therefore, that's where you get situations where it's blah, 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 this important thing, super buried in the middle, blah, 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 right? Because you're thinking as you are speaking. That's super important to recognize as an issue, because otherwise, everyone knows they should be concise. Like, why isn't everyone just concise then? Like, if it were that easy, right? So I think we need to realize, like, what is the root problem? And I think the root problem is we're trying to do too many things at once. So this is why when you are drafting a message, often the last few sentences you pull up to the top. Well, why is that? Because you realize what you were really trying to say as you got near to the end, as you yourself clarified your own thinking. So when you're speaking in real time, it can be a little bit harder to do, which is why I highly recommend for folks to take a moment to prepare, especially if they're presenting something, especially if you know you're going to get certain obvious questions, to take a moment to think about how you want to answer something. Because in my experience, it's extremely difficult to do that in real time for something that you are talking about for the first time. If you've talked about something often, or we've talked about it before, it becomes a lot easier, right? So we all have stories that we've told dozens of times, and you know every beat to that story. You know when people are going to laugh, you know when people are going to gasp, you know when people are going to hold their breath, because you've told the story a bunch of times. You've figured out what is the core arc of that story. But in normal conversation with your coworkers, with your boss, in a meeting, that's just not the case. So the only way I found around that is taking a few moments to prepare so you can clarify your own thinking a bit beforehand.
Totally. And we've touched a little bit on this concept of managing up. Maybe we can dive a bit deeper into that and that specific type of communication. The first thing that strikes me when I think about this is the true weirdness of the relationship, like the manager-employee relationship, because it's like, are they there to help you? Are they there to make you perform? Are they there to supervise you and punish you when you do wrong? And there's an element of all of this going on. What's the right way for someone to conceptualize this relationship in order to get the most out of it?
You mentioned a bunch of things that a manager might do. I would say the answer is D, all of the above. And I think that's why the relationship is so complex and can create anxiety, I think, on both sides. I think there are very few dynamics in our lives where someone is both there to support and guide you, but also is there to evaluate you and has the power to cut off the way you make a living, right? So the stakes are relatively high. I posted about this on LinkedIn and a bunch of people were like, well, it's kind of like the parent-child relationship in some ways. I disagree with that. First, it's kind of weird and infantilizing and paternalistic. But the other thing is, once you become an adult, most people opt in to have an ongoing relationship with their parents. And there's a spectrum. You can have as little contact with your parents as you want to, or as much as you want to. And having less contact doesn't mean that you can't pay your mortgage or pay your bills, right? And so, the power dynamic there is different once you're an adult. So yeah, I think it's a very unique relationship. And I'm still processing, what are really the takeaways there? Because I think first, just acknowledging that it's kind of a weird situation is useful. For me, it's useful because I've definitely spent nights not being able to fall asleep, being anxious because of something that happened with my manager. I think many of us have. It's almost encompassing to a certain degree that if your relationship with your manager is rocky and you are worried about being let go or you're worried about what they're thinking of you, it's almost like you can't really focus on anything else, right? It's effectively an existential threat to your psyche. Many times I've beaten myself up over that why can't I just let it go? Why can't I just care less? And I think acknowledging that, no, like there's a reason why you care so much and why this feels so heavy. That in itself removes that judgment. So you at least stop spending energy judging yourself and can kind of focus on the problem at hand and see it with a bit more clarity. So I think that's one piece. I think the other piece is that, I think a lot about information asymmetry in this situation. And there's this weird thing where both the manager and direct report want to be honest with each other. But there are some things where you can't really be that honest on both sides. And I think that that's a weird line to tread and that requires judgment. This is where savviness comes into play. Because if you share where you're struggling, but you share it in a way where you act like a quivering bowl of jello that has no internal fortitude, it does not inspire trust in your manager to give you bigger projects or to trust you to handle certain things, right? So that's kind of awkward. At the same time, people think like, oh, well, my manager has all the power. The power dynamic is one such that the firing direction goes one way. And that is true, but that's also, again, too simplistic because many managers worry about giving feedback to their team. Why would you worry? If you had all the power, why would you worry about telling so-and-so that they're doing a shitty job at this thing, right? It's because you're afraid they're going to rage quit on you. And you don't want that to happen. You're going to have to backfill this role. It's going to take 3 to 6 months. You're going to look like a bad manager. So to your manager, you're going to look incompetent and they're not going to want to give you more headcount or more responsibility. So actually, managers are just as worried as direct reports. They're just worried about different things. In some ways, managers have more at stake, different stuff at stake, let's say, because the higher you climb, the further you fall. And so they're trying to protect what they've built, their reputation as a leader. And if their team members are unhappy and unproductive, that doesn't reflect well on them, right? So I think understanding the psychology of your manager and what they're worried about is useful because A, it helps you better add value to them and better understand their world. But B, it also helps you understand your leverage. And I think that is useful, especially if you are in a function that's quite important or have skills that are difficult to replace, you are less fungible. There are some ICs that are actually, I would say, more valuable than their managers, more difficult to replace than their managers. And so you see these managers kind of catering around that person or the skip level telling the manager, it's fine, just make it work, right? Because that person has more leverage. So in any situation, I think it's useful to understand what is the leverage that I have? What is the leverage that the other person has? And to some people, this may feel a little bit Machiavellian, but I think it's practical. It's practical. It's good for you. You don't have to be weird about it. It's simply looking at a situation with clear eyes so that you can figure out what's the best course of action that is going to likely get me to the outcome that I want to get. Because if you miscalculate your leverage or you don't think about your leverage at all, this is where you get into trouble. This is where you overstep or where you take a risk that you're not aware of what could possibly go wrong or the thing goes wrong and that's not an acceptable thing for you, right? You want to take risks where if it doesn't work, you are okay with that. And that requires you to understand your leverage and the other person's leverage.
So given the complex dynamics that you've just described and how we should think about optimizing the relationship with this person, there's sort of a spectrum I've observed. On the one hand, almost like you can infantilize yourself where you just go to the boss and you're like, tell me what to do, or if you have a problem, you just kind of lay it all out on them and just push all your problems upwards. And obviously as a manager, that's very challenging, can be frustrating to deal with. There's an opposite extreme I find where you just keep this wall up and I'm a performer, I don't have any problems, everything's fine. You just want to look good for your boss and so you don't get enough feedback. You don't collaborate with them enough because you always just want to seem like you're on top of it. And probably that's not the healthy place to be either. How do you like thread that needle of showing that you're competent, but at the same time being like vulnerable, but not too much, and getting feedback in the right way and collaborating, but in the right way, that problem?
I was definitely that person that you described that had a wall up, that wanted at all costs to seem competent, to show that I was independent, that I can handle this, give me more. And I think a lot of high performers fall in this bucket. A lot of high performers, I would say, have a high pain threshold where you can deal with a lot of bullshit and a lot of struggle and still kind of seem okay. So this is, I think, definitely a strength, but it's also, there's a shadow side to that. There's a weakness. It can be a weakness too, because it's not sustainable, first of all. Eventually cracks start to show, start to feel burned out, misunderstood, resentful. It's a big one. I definitely held things in and then felt resentful of other people. So first, it's not sustainable for yourself. But second, you also don't fully take advantage of having a good manager that you can learn from when you try to keep it all in yourself. That's something that took me years to learn. I actually, had the revelation one day that my manager is actually here to support me too. Wow, weird, right? Like before, I was so hyper-focused on the evaluation piece. It does take judgment to thread that needle. Probably the simplest framework that I have for threading that needle is bringing up challenges in a way that make me seem competent, but also objectively show where I'm having challenges or where I feel that there's a bottleneck. So it's all the same problem per se, but the way that you express it and the way that you bring it up makes a huge difference. So to your point, you can just lay it all, verbal vomit on them and complain and say like, this is all really hard. I don't know what to do. I feel stuck. That's one way, and that makes you seem more junior. The senior person has all those same problems too. They're just framing it in a more organized way that makes them look more competent, right? So framing up what the problem is, what you've tried so far, where you would like support. Very simple. If you do that and you use bottom line up front, bluff, you make it very clear that you have attempted to solve this, and those attempts have been rooted in logic and common sense, and you make it really clear how your boss can help you. And when you frame it that way, you are able to get the support that you need, but you also seem like a competent person who has your shit together.
It just reminded me of a post that you had written about being clear about the sort of feedback you want. I think we've all had that experience of like, I don't want to share this with my boss because I'm just going to get back like a ton of commentary on things that aren't even finished yet or aren't even ready for feedback. And so we hold ourselves back. And it's really simple framing of like, I want feedback on the big picture. I want feedback on XYZ. It's that little extra level of thought about how you approach that person. That actually makes it easier for them as well.
It totally makes it easier for them. Your boss does not want to spend an hour giving you detailed feedback if you wanted a 10-minute initial reaction from them, making sure that you were going in the right direction. So you really need to help people help you. You can't expect them to read your mind. And when you send someone something for feedback, again, think about de-risking and the obvious way something could go wrong, right? If I send this to you, one obvious thing that could go wrong is you give me a bunch of line edits when really I wanted directional feedback. And so when you realize that, you can then take action on it. You can then clarify the kind of feedback that you're looking for. When you're worried about something, think about what can I do or say to minimize that from happening? And often it's so simple. You already know you want a high level reaction. So just tell the person that.
I want to touch on a subject that even I almost hate the phrase because it feels like some sort of like government bureaucratic process. And the phrase is change management. I don't know how we could have come up with a more like sort of mind-numbing way of describing it. But it's when you are in the position, as many people who are revenue operators who listen to the show are, or really any leader, let's say, of like needing to get people to do something different. Like I have a plan, I have an idea, I want you to change your behavior, or I want you to start doing something. And it is so hard to do that because you either get ignored, you get resistance, you get pushback, you get, what about this? Good ideas fail because of this. What have you seen work well? Any techniques, any strategies in this area?
I think one of the biggest areas to start with is to realize the first principle that almost everything at work boils down to getting people to do the thing you want them to do. That applies internally and externally. Externally, it's customers, leads, prospects, investors, the press. It's all these external people that you want them to click, download, upgrade, sign up, fill out this form to do a demo, whatever it might be. You want people to do something. Internally, it's managing up to your boss. You want certain things from your boss. You want certain things from your direct report. You want your team to act a certain way. So it all boils down to getting people to do the thing you want them to do. So what flows from that? I think studying sales, studying psychology, understanding behavioral economics, those are all really simple foundational topics that I think every leader should at least do some basic reading on. Marketing your ideas, right? Building hype for your ideas. That's one piece. The second is I like thinking about aligning my idea through the lens of what's interesting, valuable, relevant, and useful for the other person. So often when we have an idea, we look at it from our point of view. Why is it interesting, relevant, and useful for me? It is obviously useful for me because I'm asking you to do it. So that's kind of the baseline. I don't need to necessarily explain from that view because it's baked in why I'm asking you to do something, right? You really need to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and think about what would make this exciting for that other person. And I have a really simple example that a newsletter reader replied to my article called How to Get an Enthusiastic Yes, where I essentially write about this process of framing things through the lens of the other person. And he was saying that he wanted to get out of a work trip. There was this work event, his boss wanted him to go. He felt like it was kind of stupid and useless and he doesn't like to travel. And instead of saying, hey boss, I think this is stupid and useless and I don't like to travel, which would not go over well, it would make you seem selfish and like you're not a team player, right? Instead of saying that, he thought, what if I put this framework into practice and thought about what my boss cares about? And so he ended up writing his boss an email and said, hey boss, you want me to go to this event. I have these 3 projects that I think are more important to get across the finish line. And I'd like to focus on these because you've shared that, these were the priority. I'm happy to go to the event, but wanted to mention so that we can align on what the priority is. And his manager came back to him and said, oh, totally. You should skip that event. You should definitely focus on these areas. Beautiful. So simple, so beautiful. I love it, right? Same situation, just what he chose to share and how he chose to frame the situation made all the difference. And in fact, because he framed it the way that he did, he actually seems more strategic. Wow, you're thinking about what's best for the business. You're thinking about not wasting time going to an event you don't need to be at. You're thinking about how can I be most effective in my work to add the most value. So he got what he wanted and he seems like an even better employee because of it. So it makes a huge difference framing things through the perspective of the other person.
And so much of that just boils down to empathy, which is something that you've written about before, in the sense of being able to put yourself into the mind of that person, understand the world, through their eyes, understand their priorities.
I have a love-hate relationship with the word empathy because I feel like people usually use empathy to mean understanding, being kind, being soft,
I feel for
feeling
you.
for you. Yeah, it's very much obviously there's the definition of the word, but it's also in what context is it used in? And it's usually used in the context of you should be more understanding to me. I want you to be more empathetic to my situation. And one level further, maybe not be so demanding of me. But I think that managers and leaders, the core of your job is to confront problems, to confront people, confront situations, and you have to be able to confront. I have a post coming up called Positive Confrontation that's all about how can you be really direct with people, but also be really reasonable or be perceived as really reasonable. That's definitely a skill. There's a lot of people who are super direct, who confront, and it turns into conflict. And that's not great. No one's happy about that. It takes a lot of emotional labor on both sides to resolve. But there are ways where you can confront where your team members actually appreciate you for confronting them, that they actually get value from you confronting them. They appreciate you for keeping them on the hook, for asking them to put skin in the game. And that's ultimately what you want to do as a leader. And so, with empathy, that's part of it because you need to be able to understand the other person to be able to cater to them and speak to them and figure out how to get the best from them and change their behavior. But I think about empathy very much through a pragmatic lens as a means to an end. I guess that's the best way to put it. I see it as a means to an end, which again can sound a little bit Machiavellian, but this is work, right? This is work here, with your family. Just be empathetic for the sake of it. Great, right? But at work, I think it's useful to see it as a means to an end. And the end is to do better work together, to create more value for the organization together. And in order to be able to do that, we need to empathize with each other enough so we can communicate and frame things so that it's easy for the other person to understand. It's exciting for them to take action on, but I see it all as a means to an end. I think the problem is when people see it as an end in and of itself. That is where I have a little bit of a challenge with that, because it's often used to justify lower standards, I think.
I think we have time for probably just one question, and I wanted to take it in a totally different direction and just talk to you about your work on LinkedIn, which has obviously been a huge platform for you to get your ideas out. I see, pretty much every one of your posts gets hundreds and hundreds of reactions. And it's a short form of writing, and it can often lend itself to these very almost formulaic, caricatured forms of writing. And you don't go in for that, and yet you still are really getting a very strong response from the audience, which is fantastic to see. I'm curious how you think about this platform, your approach. Are you being strategic in any particular way, or are you just putting your ideas out there and seeing what flows from them?
Great question. I think if you are a leader that wants to start sharing content, you need to be mindful of who you're modeling after, because there's a lot of different archetypes, I would say, on LinkedIn. There are many archetypes in general in the world, but on LinkedIn, you really see that. And so if you're modeling and learning and copying from a certain kind of archetype, you're giving certain signals to your audience. So there's a certain style of writing on LinkedIn, which is one sentence paragraphs. And the thinking behind that is it's very skimmable, it's fun to read, but the downside is it also looks a little bit spammy. And creators who are a little bit spammy do that plus other things in the way that they share on LinkedIn. And readers are very good at pattern matching. As humans, we naturally pattern match. So in a split second, when you see a certain kind of post, you're already thinking, oh, it's probably that kind of post. On the other hand, you see people share on LinkedIn where they're writing paragraphs. And you might think, well, no one reads paragraphs. You have to make it skimmable. Most people read on mobile. But the act of writing in a paragraph is also a signal. And you are attracting a certain kind of person. You're attracting the kind of person who has the attention span to read paragraphs. And you are showing that you are the kind of person who doesn't care about pandering to the algorithm. So with everything that you do, there's a trade-off and there's a signal that you're giving. And so if you choose to share in a way that is more thoughtful, sometimes the reach just isn't as good. That's just the nature of being on social platforms. There are many times where I can think of a juicier hook for what I want to write. I can make it sound more extreme. I can make it sound more controversial. I can sound angrier, and that will all get more clicks and more views. But do I want to do that? Not really. Do I want to engage with people who react to stuff like that? And what kind of conversation are we going to have, in the comments from that? Not ones that I'm that excited about. And so thinking about the kind of person you want to reach, the kind of conversations you want to have, the signals you want to put out into the world about the kind of person you are, those are all super helpful to think about. And I don't think enough people think about that. I think most people look up LinkedIn algorithm tips and follow advice like post 3 to 5 times a week, post at the same time every day, comment on 10 to 15 other people's posts. There's a lot of advice like that out there. And I think the more useful thing is to think about, what kind of person am I? What kind of person do I want people to think I am? And what kind of people do I want to attract? And then to look for a couple people that you admire that are doing that style of posting. And then look at what they do. That's a much better starting point.
Hey everyone, I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.